It is the 27th of November 2016, and the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix has not yet started. Nico Rosberg leads the World Championship by 12 points. Lewis Hamilton needs to win the race and needs Rosberg to finish third or lower to take the title on countback. The mathematics are simple. What is not simple is what happens on the formation lap when Hamilton, who is on pole position, who has won the last 3 races in a row, who has been the faster driver for the final third of the season, begins slowing, not mechanically, deliberately. He is controlling the pace of the field behind him, bunching the pack, creating the conditions for a restart chaos that might push Rosberg backward through the order. His engineers instruct him to maintain the correct formation lap pace. He does not. They instruct him again. He does not. In the Mercedes garage, Toto Wolff and Paddy Lowe are watching a driver use the most dominant car in the history of the hybrid era as an instrument of tactical manipulation against his own teammate in front of a global television audience of 400 million people. By the time you understand what the Mercedes W07 was and what happened inside the team that built it across the course of the 2016 season, you will understand why the most technically complete Formula One car of the turbo hybrid era nearly became the vehicle through which a 3-time world champion destroyed not just a championship, but a partnership, a team culture, and his own legacy. This is the story of the Mercedes W07 Hybrid. Not just the car that won 19 races, the car that won 19 races while its 2 drivers conducted the most destructive internal war in the sport since Senna and Prost shared an MP4/4 in 1988. And the story of how those 2 things, the engineering dominance and the human disintegration, were not separate. They were the same story. To understand the W07, you need to understand what Mercedes had been building since 2014. The hybrid power unit regulations that came into force that year, combining a 1.6-liter turbocharged V6 internal combustion engine with a motor generator unit heat recovering energy from the exhaust and a motor generator unit kinetic recovering energy from braking, the combined system producing approximately 860 horsepower in race specification with an additional 160 horsepower available from the electrical deployment, had been developed in parallel by Mercedes, Ferrari, and Renault across the preceding 3 years. Mercedes had committed more resource to the power unit program than any rival. The result was a performance advantage in the hybrid system's efficiency, the ratio of energy harvested to energy deployed, and the precision of the deployment mapping. That independent analysis placed at between 30 and 40 horsepower over the Ferrari unit and between 60 and 80 horsepower over the Renault in the regulation's first season. The W05 that won the 2014 championship had won 16 of 19 races. The W06 that won 2015 had won 16 of 19 races. The W07 was the 3rd iteration of a platform that had been continuously developed for 3 years with no year 0 reset, each car building directly on the aerodynamic and mechanical knowledge base of its predecessor. Paddy Lowe, who had joined Mercedes from McLaren in 2013 as executive technical director, and the aerodynamic team led by Mike Elliott, had by 2016 produced a car whose development trajectory had one defining characteristic. Every development update introduced across the preceding 2 seasons had been directionally correct. Nothing had been taken off the car. Every aerodynamic addition had added performance. The accumulated development of 3 years of directionally correct work had produced a car that, by the measurements available from corner speed data and tire degradation analysis, was operating with a total aerodynamic efficiency advantage over the Ferrari SF16H of between 12 and 15% at the season's midpoint. The power unit advantage had been reduced. Ferrari's 2016 unit was closer to Mercedes than it had been in 2014 or 2015, but the aerodynamic gap more than compensated. The W07 was, on the data, the most complete Formula One car that the hybrid era had produced to that point. The car's aerodynamic architecture had been developed around the specific characteristics of the Mercedes power unit installation, the compact dimensions of the hybrid system's energy store and deployment electronics, which occupied less volume than any rival's equivalent, allowed Lowe's team to tighten the car's rear bodywork to a degree that produced airflow conditions at the rear diffuser unavailable to Ferrari or Red Bull, regardless of their aerodynamic sophistication. The cooling architecture, managing the thermal output of the internal combustion engine, the turbocharger, the two motor generator units, and the energy store, had been compressed across 3 seasons of development into a package that permitted rear bodywork geometry that rivals consistently identified as the W07's most difficult performance characteristic to replicate. You could measure it, you could not copy it without the power unit that made it possible. The front suspension geometry that the W07 employed, a zero-keel pull rod front suspension arrangement whose development had been continuous since 2012, produced front tire behavior that Pirelli's tire engineers identified as the primary reason the Mercedes drivers could complete race stints of 30 to 35 laps on compounds that rival drivers were managing for 20 to 25. The front tire operating temperature range in which the W07 delivered its designed grip level was, by Pirelli's data, wider than any other car on the grid. In races where tire degradation was the defining strategic variable, which in 2016 was most races, the W07 could run longer, stop later, and rejoin in cleaner track position than cars whose pace advantage in the early laps of a stint was eroded by degradation before the pit window opened. It was the same operational principle that had defined Ross Brawn's championship strategies at Benetton and Ferrari: tire management as the primary competitive variable, chassis design as the enabler of tire management, expressed through the most technically sophisticated machinery the sport had produced. Hamilton won the first 3 races of the season in Australia, Bahrain, and China. Rosberg won in Russia, Spain, where both Mercedes retired in a collision at the first corner, and Monaco. The Spain collision was the first public evidence of a team management structure that had, across the preceding 2 seasons, been managing an internal competition whose intensity was increasing faster than the team's protocols could contain it. Hamilton and Rosberg had known each other since childhood karting. The familiarity that this history produced was not warmth. It was a precise and detailed knowledge of each other's strengths, weaknesses, and psychological pressure points that both drivers used with a deliberateness that their public statements, carefully moderated by the team's communications operation, did not fully reveal. After Spain, after the collision that handed Red Bull's Max Verstappen his first Formula One victory on his debut in a senior car, Wolff delivered a statement that described the incident as unacceptable and promised consequences. The consequences were a framework agreement on racing conduct that both drivers signed and neither driver fully observed for the remainder of the season. Hamilton won in Canada, Austria, and the British Grand Prix at Silverstone, where he took pole position with a lap of 1 minute 29.232 seconds, the fastest lap ever recorded at the circuit at that point, in a car carrying full race fuel loads. Rosberg won in Germany, Hungary, and Belgium. Going into the Italian Grand Prix at Monza, the championship was level. Both drivers had won 7 races. The second half of the season was where the gap between them became visible in the data rather than the results. Hamilton's pace in qualifying, specifically his ability to find additional lap time in the final sector of a circuit on the final attempt of a qualifying session, was, across the final 9 rounds of the year, consistently ahead of Rosberg's in identical machinery. He took pole position at 7 of the final 9 races. He won 4 of them. The mechanical failures that had cost him races earlier in the season, an engine problem in Malaysia while leading, a start system failure in China, had concentrated his championship deficit into a window that made Abu Dhabi's mathematics uncomfortably tight. The formation lap incident at Abu Dhabi was the culmination of a season in which the car's dominance had removed every external variable from the championship equation and left only the relationship between two drivers who had been competing since they were 8 years old. Rosberg finished second. He finished the race in second place with sufficient points to take the championship by 5 points, regardless of what Hamilton's tactics had produced. In the post-race press conference, Rosberg was asked what winning the world championship meant. He said it meant everything. 3 weeks later, he announced his retirement from Formula One. He was 31 years old. He had won one world championship. He had driven the most dominant car in the sport's hybrid era. He had decided, in the specific way that people decide things when they have achieved the single objective that has structured their entire adult life, that there was nothing left to stay for. The W07 won 19 races from 21 starts, a win rate of 90.4%, higher than any car in the history of the sport, including the McLaren MP4 of 1988. Its successor, the W08, won 12 of 20 races in 2017 as Ferrari closed the aerodynamic gap and produced a championship fight that extended into the final rounds. The hybrid era dominance that Mercedes had built across 4 consecutive seasons began in 2017 to encounter the competitive resistance that every dominant era eventually produces. The W07 was its peak, a car so far ahead of its rivals in every measurable performance variable that the championship it produced was determined entirely by events inside the team that built it. At Yas Marina in November 2016, the most dominant car in modern Formula One history crossed the finish line in second place, driven by the man who would become world champion. In the Mercedes garage, the engineers who had spent 3 years building the platform that made it possible watched a championship decided not by aerodynamics or power units or tire strategy, but by the specific and irreducible human variable that no engineering program has ever found a way to design out. The W07 could win 19 races. It could not resolve what two drivers who had known each other since childhood would do to each other when one of them needed to lose. If this is the kind of story that brought you here, subscribe. It is the only way this channel keeps producing the history behind the results. Leave a comment. Was the W07 the greatest Formula One car of the hybrid era? Or did the season it produced reveal the limits of what engineering dominance can actually control? Next time, we go inside the innovation that Formula One introduced to solve one problem and spent a decade discovering it had created another.